I can't hear you, brother.
Greetings. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So greetings, family. As
I can't hear you, brother.
Whoops. Where is it coming from? Can you hear me now? I can hear a sound feedback. So greetings, family.
Can't hear you.
Did you have something playing on?
No.
Something was playing. It was a feedback. Okay.
Can't hear you.
Now, can you hear me now? Did you have something playing on?
No.
Something was playing. It was a feedback. Okay. Can't hear you. Now, can you hear me now? Did you have something playing on?
No.
Something was playing. It was a feedback. Okay.
Can't hear you.
Now, can you hear me now? Did you have something playing on? Hold on 1 second. There's a feedback. Yeah, now there was a feedback going on in the background. Now we sorted that out. Peace and blessings, everyone. I hope you have come and joined us as we have a special guest in the house. But before we go to the special guest. We've got many shows that are coming on later on this week. We've got the Total Exposure where we're giving the entertainment platforms to perform. So that'll be at 9 p.m. But, you know, today is about certain subjects and we're going to go in on understanding a bit of history, a bit of understanding on migration, immigration and the whole thing and the generational gap. So before we go in, I'm going to introduce one of our elders. And before I even say anything, before I even been speaking, I have to ask permission from our elders. Am I allowed to speak?
Yeah, you have permission.
Okay, yes, you see, you have to have respect for our elders as much as possible, you know, but sometimes we can run away with things. But yes, Oba TShaka, we finally got you onto the channel, and I just want you to give some information of who you are and what you're about.
Well, my name is Oba T'Shaka, and I'm a 60-year movement organizer. I'm a spiritual scholar warrior. So what that means is my development started in 1960 when I joined the Black Freedom Movement. Some people call it the Civil Rights Movement. And that was in the Congress of Racial Equality from 1960 to 1966. And I led the largest of the northern Black freedom movements in the United States a 10,000 person movement, and the only movement that defeated an entire economic power structure for jobs for Blacks and people of color. In the southern part of the United States in 1960, the big issue was segregation or apartheid, the denial of the right to vote, and Blacks being segregated and humiliated. And so Blacks fought against that and scored the first victory since Reconstruction against white supremacy. And that's one that Donald Trump is really trying to reverse now. He tried to do it by stealing the election, and Blacks and brown people especially outmaneuvered him. And as one of my videos that I show on my show, the Dr. Oba T'Shaka show, says, we took him out of the White House and he's now getting ready for the jailhouse because he's got so many prosecutions facing him, he'd be in trouble. So my initiation as a conscious person was in the freedom movement, and in this case for jobs. And we're the only movement in the North that mastered the environment and defeated an entire economic power structure, producing jobs for Blacks and people of color. Up to that point, there were no jobs other than sweeping streets, shining shoes, or working in the post office or the waterfront, where my father worked with a loaded and unloaded ships. And that was the end of World War II. There were no jobs. And so my initiation into consciousness was in that battlefield, and I underwent an awakening in that movement because I had been miseducated, 4 years of university, 2 years of law school, and my mind was on remote control and didn't know it. The movement woke me up. Everyday Black people woke me up, and it caused me to then re-educate myself. Marcus Bookstore, which still stands, became my university, as it was for Dr. Asa Hilliard, Dr. Wade Nobles, and a number of others, as Michelle's bookstore was for Malcolm X. And so I began to start to reorient my education and throw out my miseducation. And so that awakening process was key. After that, after defeating the economic power structure in San Francisco, I tried to turn National Corps into a Black Power organization a year before Black Power. And I chaired the National Corps Convention in Durham, North Carolina, where I chaired the resolutions committee and got 32 resolutions unanimously passed. Black Power was a good slogan, but this was a program. And the program was restructuring CORE so it served grassroots Black people. And one of the things it called for was taking white money out of CORE. I'm a warrior. And as a warrior, I've never accepted pay for my work, not from whites or Blacks. 1 year, I got Black businesses to support a group that I formed after CORE called Pan-African People's Organization. Other than that, I became a follower of the Honorable Marcus Garvey and embraced the idea of self-reliance. And so 32 resolutions got passed at that National Corps Convention, one of which voted white money out of CORE, others that restructured CORE to be grassroots oriented. Unfortunately, that was not continued. And so I moved into a group called Pan-African People's Organization, which I'm still in, that has worked with the Pan-African Congress movement around African Liberation Day, that sent a delegation through a group, through a number of other groups, that sent a delegation to the 6th Pan-African Congress. And I chaired the political committee there. And that's where I hooked up with the Pan-African Congress movement, Ron Phillips and others who were very conscious. And since then, we've had a long-term relationship where we held African Liberation Days here of 30,000 people a year in Oakland. And we would go to African Liberation Day in the United Kingdom for a good 30 years. And then in 1980, I was a co-founder of the National Black United Front that I served as national vice chair of for about 23 years, and orchestrated the movement to get an African curriculum into the public schools, which was very successful. And then inside the Pan-African People's Organization, we built an independent Black school that still stands, the African Children's Advanced Learning Center. We marched 7,000 Black children out of the public schools and pulled together the Black community, and they planned a curriculum, and it's been operating full-time since then. In addition to that, I became a professor at San Francisco State University in 1972, and the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, had already denied me a teaching credential, and it tried to assassinate me 3 times. I faced assassinations, and not by accident, I'm still here. I'm a warrior, so I've never lost a battle. I don't believe in losing. And so at San Francisco State, with the help of Dr. Asa Hilliard, who some of your audience may know and many do not know, a great African-American scholar, a wonderful human being. He was then dean of the College of Education at San Francisco State, the only Black dean. And when I went up for what's called tenure, that's where they either decide to make you permanent or not. He was on my committee. And every effort was made because the FBI was orchestrating a campaign to deny me tenure, because under the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, they tried to kill the leadership. If they couldn't, put it in jail. If they couldn't, exile it. And if they couldn't, take their economic base away from them. They had already tried to kill me, and that didn't work. They had already tried to take a job away from me in the public schools. I let them on that one because my spirit told me not to fight. It's the only time my spirit told me not to fight. By the way, I'm a spiritual scholar warrior. And my best stuff, when I get into my scholarship, comes from above, piping into God's mind. So my intuition has always helped me out, as it's helped out a lot of Black people. So in the end, I was tenured. And for 40 years, I taught at San Francisco State, 16,000 students. And I radicalized them. And what I would always tell them at the beginning of each semester is, now this wasn't really true. I said the system was dumb enough to hire me. Actually, I beat them because they didn't want to hire me. And then I said, but I'm smart enough to try and radicalize your Black behinds. And so I did my best to do that. And then during that course, I became a writer. And so I've written 5 books, and I'm finishing my 6th. And I'm an organic scholar, which means my scholarship comes from the grassroots and then from serious study. You might see behind me a library. I have a library of 10,000 books, and I'm constantly reading. I asked my grandmother when I was grown up, I remember a lot about my childhood, I mean, key thing. I said, grandmother, what was I like? She said, you'd ride a bicycle and you have a book under your hand. At that time, I was reading the wrong books. But when I woke up, I started reading the right books, which is Black books. And then I could see, because I underwent an awakening, I could begin to see my enemy through my own eyes. And I began to study my enemy. So I've written 5 books. The first one was The Political Legacy of Malcolm X. And this book was reviewed in the New York Times by a man named Michael Eric Dyson. And he ranked it number 1 against all books on Malcolm X. And this is a book that allows Malcolm to speak for himself. And because I'm an organizer, a lot of people needed direction in terms of organizing. I spent 10 years and I wrote 2 volumes called The Art of Leadership. Volume 1, this is volume 1. And on there, you'll see the guy with the sunglasses is Amilcar Cabral, who you see in the background here. In the middle is Ella Baker, who was the mother of the Southern Freedom Movement. And on the top, Marcus Garvey, and then Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. These are not books on great leaders. These are books on leadership systems, organizing strategies, and approaches. And it's over 900 pages. And a second volume, Art of Leadership, Volume 2. And so this is designed to train young people in the art of leadership and organizing. And I have a leadership training institute called Perank, which is the ancient university system of ancient Kemet or Egypt, which means house of life. Perank Amilcar Cabral, the person you see behind me and with the sunglasses that I just showed you a picture of, the greatest leader in the 20th century, Amilcar Cabral. He led the armed struggle for freedom in Africa in the 60s and early 70s. Best thinker, best organizer. Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker, as I pointed out, mother of the Southern Freedom Movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. No Ella Baker, no Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was one of the two best organizer leaders in the 60s, Malcolm X being the other in San Francisco, in the United States. So it's called the Perank Amilcar Cabral Ella Baker Leadership Academy. And we train people in leadership, mainly first through taking them through a system of awakening that I call the sixfold stages to mental freedom, which is the path that Malcolm X went through when he woke up, that I went through, Cabral and many others. And then the hardest thing I ever did in my life was write this book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. And this is a book that comes through piping into God's mind. In other words, every now and then I've been privileged enough for God to give me some answers to difficult questions. And this one answers the big question of what's the basis of the just societies of Africa? And I'm the only scholar in the world that is uncovered because God gave me the answer. I just did the research, but without God's help, I'd have never got the answer. Only scholar in the world to accurately define what is the African family system of Africa that's the secret to African justice and greatness. And so that return to the African mother principle, male and female equality. In the 60s, I led the campaign against the biggest bank in the world for jobs, the Bank of America. And it took 11 cities, 6 months to defeat them. I had a strategy. I'm a strategist. The first thing I do better than anything is strategy. Strategy is the ultimate art. I love it more than anything other than the truth in God, my mother and father, my wife and family. Strategy. The reason why I've never lost a battle is strategy. You understand? Now, so we took down the biggest bank in the world, beat them with strategy. I thought that was the hardest thing I ever did. Return to the African mother principle of male and female equality was far harder to write and far more enjoyable because I was drawing on the wisdom of God. And so it took 15 disciplines to write this book. It was rough. And it's a book that people can understand. But I'll tell you, it will help you with your relationships and your families. And it's good for all families, but especially African families. My fifth book is The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. Those last words, a choice between two cultures, comes from God. Those are not my words. Comes from the beautiful light. This picture that you see standing there, this little man with his left foot forward and a staff, and to his right, above his head, 3 vertical registers. Those registers means great one. This one is a great one who came to the palace in Hemin to worship the god who you see on the right, an animal with 2 ears. That's Set, because in ancient Kemet, the pharaoh's representative was Horus, but who was the son of Asar, the founding ancestor of ancient Kemet. But for the pre-dynastic Kemites, which this little man represented, the founders of Kemet, which came into being over 10,000 BC, this is a picture of the rulers of Kemet. Pre-dynastic, they founded everything that became Kemetic civilization. And they were Twa or Anu, as they called them, Anu people. So this is these are the 5 books I've written, and the sixth one I'm finishing now, which is on Seba, Seba, and that means the star. It literally is a word for star, and it's the notion that every person has within them a light, a star, and that's their gift. And so Seba is the African idea of how you educate. George Washington Carver, the greatest scientist in the 20th century, said, you cannot teach anybody anything. What you have to do is bring out what is within them. And that is basically what Seba is. That's the art of teaching, bringing out the gifts that the student already has and encouraging them to pursue it. So my 6th book, it may be 2 volumes, it may not. I finished 550 pages. It'll be out sometime the early part of next year. I would have been finished by now, but I'm doing this show, the Dr. Oba T'Shaka show. So it's taken some time away from writing. So that's some of what I have and what I do.
Okay, so Baba, let's get into the nitty gritty and understanding. But first, before I even go into anything, I always ask this question, and you kind of headship that in the fact of what you've just said so far. And I'm an advocate of Black family first. So I always ask anyone that comes on our show in the fact that, what does Black family first mean to you?
Well, family is the foundation for everything in society. The only thing that comes ahead of family is God. God comes first. And God's a great force and a great spirit. It's not a he or a she. I've seen God, and most beautiful experience of my life. Family is what carries on God's work if family is right. So family to me is foundation. But for me, being a spirit scholar warrior, I've always been in pursuit of, as our people have, of how do we get justice in the world? And so in pursuit of that, the book that I showed you on the mother principle, that was in pursuit of that. And what I was able to discover in my work on that, again, through piping into God's mind, George Washington Carver called it thinking God's thoughts. God gave me the formula for African families. What was the secret for their justice? And then that was the secret for the justice of African villages. That was the secret for the justice of African economies. That was the secret for the justice of African nations. And that was really also the secret for the brilliance of African people, because for African people, truth and wisdom are inseparable. For white, IQ has got nothing to do with truth. IQ. But for us, wisdom proceeds from truth. And so families, the way in which families are structured, the way in which families operate for African people have been foundational. And so it was my discovery of this, what has been before unknown basis for what is the foundation of African families. And it was that discovery that enabled me to see not only that, but to see who were the founding people of African societies. And what is really the secret for the greatness of African people, their kindness, for example? What was the secret of their humanity? So in the family. So it was in the discovery of the model for just societies found in the world's first families, found among a people called the Chwa. Europeans call them pygmies. We know very little about them because they've been written out of history and put in anthropology books. But they came into being 144,000 years ago. And we know this according to mitochondrial DNA. That's the DNA that comes from the mother that lasts forever. And so we know that from what they've discovered in the Congo and the Kalahari Desert among the Ku and the Biaka Chwa of the Congo, we know that their DNA, mitochondrial DNA, traces back to the beginning. Approximately 144,000 years ago, mitochondrial DNA has an error rate of 10,000 years, forward or backward. So it could be 154,000 or 134,000. But it's within that range that these two people are the mothers and fathers of humanity. And they developed the family systems that is the very basis for African greatness and African power, and served as the foundation for the family systems of the world in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. So in understanding like the core of the family, right? And a lot of people have got a misconception of understanding the masculine and feminine energy in the form of gender. A lot of people channel into understanding masculine and feminine sex, gender, instead of masculine, feminine, masculine energy. So I just want you to give us a clear understanding of the two identities and why the two identities need each other.
Okay, now that's a good question, because that kind of ties into what the model is. Because the question is, paradigm is a model, and it's what's the model? And we know that for Europeans, their paradigm is one model: males in charge of everything. That's their model. We call that patriarchy. And it's a rugged, vicious system because it empowers men to do whatever they want to do. And it's a very arbitrary and can be a very brutal system. And many have made the mistake of thinking that therefore African family systems were just the opposite, matriarchy, where women were in control. And while it's true that some African family systems were matriarchal, with women having more power, even when that was the case, never did they have exclusive power. But in looking at African family systems, when I was asking God, what was the basis of just societies? And I had a beautiful experience. I experienced a beautiful light. God is a white light. Most who have gone to the other side have seen that, have said that. And for me, without speaking, what was revealed to me is that the basis of just societies in Africa was societies in which all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. And so immediately I knew that God had given me the formula for the Twa. I knew that that was the Twa. That's how the Twa operated. I had not identified that as the basis for their justice, but I knew that that's who God was referring me to, the Twa. And so what did this mean? In Twa societies, you had men and women who shared power equally. Men had no more power than women. Women had no more power than men. And these were in hunter-gatherer societies. And in hunter-gatherer societies, men were the hunters, women were the gatherers. And so in hunting and gathering, and this is the first form of economic organization in the world and the most just, in these societies, women were often more likely to be able to come up with food because they would go into the forest or the desert. And in the case of the first two people, it's the Kum in the Kalahari Desert and the Biaka Chwa in the Congo. And so the Kalahari Desert is a rough environment. So men would go out and hunt, but not every day would they find game. But every day the women would bring back this raw vegetation and make food of it. So both were playing an equal role in the economy. This also gave rise to a decision-making system in which men and women were equally involved in decision-making. Africans give birth to democracy. And so our form of democracy is not majority vote, it's consensus. And most African historians are in agreement on that. But it comes from the Twa 100,000 years of operation. So your masculine feminine thing that you're asking about, what you find in Twa societies is among the Kum, the first two children get the father's last name. The next two, or those after, get the mother's last name. What does this tend to tell you? Because in African or in world family systems, they are based on where descent comes from. Who do you trace descent from? So in a, or, you know, if you're going to inherit wealth in a family, whose line does it go through? And so under patriarchy, it goes through the male's line. Women don't have much power there. And under matriarchy, the very few that existed, very few in Africa, would go through the female's line. But what you're finding in African family systems, they're going through the male-female line. And this is starting with the Twa. So what you're finding is among the Twa, men take care of children as well as women. They feed them, they carry them, they sing to them, they're very kind to them. And so what you're finding is in African family systems, the Twa lay the foundation. And what you find is that while the male is the hunter, and in the event of any need for defense is the first defender, his qualities that are most important are kindness. His qualities are nurturing. His qualities are caring. But at the same time, he represents the hardness that will stand in the way of a people's enemy, someone that's going to try and disrupt life in the hunter-gatherer society or later in villages or later in African nations. And so what you see is that African family systems also reflect a philosophy. And this philosophy or deep thought, as Dr. Jacob Carruthers, one of our great scholars, used to call it, or the Dogon call it, deep knowledge, comes out of a philosophy where you have the masculine, you have the feminine. And masculine is referring to the creative side of the human being. The feminine, the nurturing and the wise side, the wisdom of the mother. And what you find is that within the feminine is the masculine, within the masculine is the feminine, but always there's a clear definition of what it is to be a male and what it is to be a female. And the male is expected to be a source of strength, of defense and protection, and of support. But as you noted in one of the series that we did on my show with Dr. Sirig McDougall, when Black men usually describe support, they don't just mean bringing in some finances, they mean bringing in some care, bringing in some kindness, bringing in some love. So this idea of African family systems being based on a male, female, masculine, feminine interplay has been the secret to our humanity. It's also been the secret to our power. And we've always understood that no male without the female, no female without the male, no masculine without the feminine, no feminine without the masculine. And so I call these systems not matriarchy, ruled by women, not patriarchy, ruled by man. And by the way, in my book, I studied 14 ancient African systems, family systems that came before Islam and Christianity to see if this model that God gave me of African families being based and African societies being based on all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society, did it play out? And I found when I took 14 ancient African family systems, 13 of those 14 perfectly fit this model. And some of them, the Yoruba, they would be described in many Yoruba family systems. The last name of the child comes from the father, but there are Yoruba family systems where the last name comes from the mother. Or the Asante, which has a focus around females, but it has a twin family system and a system where at the lineage level, the Opanyan, who is the eldest, wisest, most just male, is picked by the eldest and wisest and most just male and female, and is accountable to the lineage, which is made up of males and females. And the decisions are not made by him, but it's the consensus of the lineage. And so I said, so when I looked at these family systems, they were not matriarchy or patriarchy. Matrilineal, even though the last name might come from the mother's family, or it might come from the father's family, or in the case of some like Sundiata or Sunjata, his name came from mother and father. And so Sun, son of the Lion King, Jata, son of the buffalo woman. He had a hunchbacked mother who represented the buffalo. So his name itself didn't reflect matrilineal or patrilineal, matriarchy or patriarchy. They reflected both. And by the way, in the African American tradition, and you may have this in the Caribbean, it was customary in enslavement that a girl child was named after her father because the father was the one that was often sold. So to remember him, she would take a name like Joseph and it would become Josephine. She would feminize the masculine name. So what you're seeing here is something twin, both masculine and feminine in the naming system. So I said, these families are not matriarchies or patriarchies. They're not matrilineal or patrilineal. I came up with a new term. They're twinlineal, meaning you are descended not just from your mother or your father, you're descended from both. And so, and not just from grandmother or grandfather, but from both. And if God is he, God is she. God isn't either one of those. God's a great spirit. But if you're going to conceive of God as one, you're going to have to conceive of God as the other, because it takes two to tango, meaning it takes two to create something. And God is the greatest creator of all. So Dr. Theophilus Benga, who was Shekinah Diop's best student, who I hired at San Francisco State along with Wade Nobles and other faculty, we hired him as a faculty person, and he taught for 11 years in our department, speaks 10 languages, written 17 books. He said of the mother principle, he said, the book's a classic. And then he said, the term twinlineal should be in the dictionary. So the key point is, you will find in African family systems this interplay of masculine and feminine. And generally, the family systems that work the best are the ones that have that going. And usually, what Black women will say about good Black men, the key thing they'll say more than anything, he's kind. He's kind. If he's a good Black man, and to a sister, that's more important than almost anything else. Then smart, hardworking, loving, but kind. Whereas in the West, being brutal and tough. And Trump is a good example of this. A pandemic is wiping out hundreds of thousands of people in this country, and he has no care, no concern. You know, he's an example of this kind of model. So
okay. Okay, so Baba T'Shaka, when we go from that understanding of the family, the next protocol that I always try to break down in the fact that is the rites of passage, because this is the beginning. Once we're going through the path of that family, and the rites of the ancient ways and how it is today, because I feel that there is no kind of guideline of teaching in the forms of rites of passage for our youth. So then our youth don't understand in the directions or focus on the pinpoint of the right things to maneuver in the right direction. So I just want you to first kind of break down what is a rites of passage, and why would you feel that it's essential that we in place that rites of passage so that we can able to create that form of legacy?
Rites of passage, there are many different rites of passage in Africa. So one rites of passage is the rites of passage that you're focusing on, which is the rites of passage from boyhood to manhood, girlhood to womanhood. That's one rites of passage. There's another rites of passage, which is after you've achieved manhood, then it's the rites of passage of mastery. And that's the rites of passage of mastery of whatever your destiny is, your gifts are. If you are a warrior, mastering that. If you are a priest, mastering that. If you are a doctor, mastering that, whatever it is. So that's another level. Among the Bambara, that was a 21-year process from the age of 21 to 42. So in the West, that would be called university education, but that's only 4 years. The African one, in the African system, to know the truth, you have to be the truth. So it is becoming whatever your gifts are and mastering them. So that's another level. And then, of course, there's the transition to elderhood, which is another transformational stage. So going to the one that you're dealing with now, which is rites of passage from boyhood or girlhood to manhood or womanhood. Well, first of all, in traditional Africa before the coming of the European, this was a key part of transformation in life. And what they would say to a young boy or young girl, and they had special initiation ceremonies for each, they would tell them they were going to die. So the first idea that they had about rites of passage, and they would last for varying periods of time, they would take them away from the village, away from the community, and they would be under the supervision of elders, elder males or for the males and elder females for the females. And so they thought they were literally going to die. And so the process was a rigorous process of training that transitions them from boyhood to manhood. And so there were many trials that they were taken through. And these trials would sometimes lead to death. These were very rough trials. And almost every enslaved African that came to the US or the Caribbean or South America had gone through these rites of passage, because by the time of 18, you had completed those rites of passage. And the average age for an enslaved African was between the ages of 18 and 35. The women were taken through rough rites of passage that also transformed them into being women. The men were taught how to be fathers and the role of fatherhood. The men were taught the importance of responsibility and what it meant to adhere to truth and to be whatever it is you said, to speak the truth. Women were taught the same thing. Men were taught courage, and the highest standards of warriorhood and manhood are found in Africa. And so one of the rites of passage was circumcision. And circumcision was a painful operation. A man could not show any sign of pain. If he did, that meant that he wasn't really a man. So to be able to withstand hardship without complaining was very important. And then wisdom, being able to listen to your elders and to learn from your elders. So this was a developmental process, and different periods of time was taken by different people. Now, when enslavement comes down, secret societies become the institution that initiate people to boyhood, to manhood, girlhood, to womanhood. And these secret societies are created by the elders to combat European culture, which is now taking people out of their culture. And so these rites of passage were also ways of seeing that. The ways of the Dogon, the ways of the Yoruba, the ways of the Asante were internalized inside of the people. And warriorhood for men was very important. They were trained in warriorhood and how to fight and how to defend. Women were trained in how to defend themselves against an unruly husband. And if this husband got wrong, to stop him. And by the way, in secret societies, there was always an elder woman in the man's secret society, but there was never an elder man in the woman's secret society, which is telling you that mother has some secrets that you're not ever going to hear about. And if you're a man and you don't know that to this day, you're in trouble. You know what I mean? You're in trouble because your mother is going to have some wisdom you're never going to have. And that wisdom is also about you. So rites of passage was when they said you were going to die, you were dying as a boy, you're being reborn as a man. You're dying as a girl, you're being reborn as a woman. And so when you come through those rites of passage, you have reached a stage of honor for a man. Honor is everything for African people. The truth is everything for African people. You have to be an embodiment of that. So if a male went through rites of passage and didn't pass, he couldn't marry. Same thing with a female. She couldn't marry because it means she or he was not qualified to be a co-head of a family, let alone do anything else. So rites of passage were very, very rigorous and always supervised by elders who are themselves masters of manhood and masters of womanhood.
So yeah, so now we've come to that stage, and you've just mentioned it in forms of the manhood and elders. What I'm finding is that we're finding it very difficult because we don't really have visible group of elders bringing their wisdom in front of us because everyone is behaving on an individual aspect. Where before, like in the past, you would go to the elders where there'll be a group of them and they were able to decide when you give them the knowledge, they were able to give us the wisdom back. But I want you to give us a little bit of a note on that, but then seeing it in how we see it today.
Yeah, in the Caribbean and South America and in the United States, one of the strong institutions that we carried out of Africa into the Americas, and this includes the United States and into the UK, into France, wherever we are now, we carried the institution of elderhood. That institution is very important. And much of the writing on enslavement doesn't give you a lot of information on that because the African coming out of secret societies was tight-lipped. The African coming out of secret societies kept secrets. And Caribbean Africans are better at this even than African Americans, because as one of your great scholars pointed out, he said African culture was dropped in the Caribbean, meaning they had exterminated the Native Americans. And so the Africans became 90, 95%, 98% of the African population. So there was a continuation of African culture in the Caribbean, whereas in the United States, we had to draw from the fundamentals of African culture and create a new African culture, fundamentally African, but it had to be extremely creative because there we were not 90% of the population. And so we had to fight more for our cultural integrity. But one of the things that enabled us to do that were our elders. And we always look to them for advice on almost anything. If you read the slave narratives, you'll see where Frederick Douglass is talking about escaping, running away. He goes to one of the elders, and the elders advises him. This elder was a diviner. These were the people who would consult your destiny and could tell your future. And he said, don't run away now. The eagle will get you. He foresaw that if he ran away at that time, he'd get caught. The eagle was the United States. He got caught. Then later, he was able to escape. So elders have been very important. So in our communities today, we've in the US and in the UK and various areas where we are in the world, there's been an erosion of the elder tradition. It's stronger in some places than others. You have a weakening of yours. Yours probably isn't as weak as in the States, but yours has been weakened. And there are forces that have weakened it. In the States, the forces were breaking up families through deindustrialization, which I talk about in this book, The Integration Trap. Jobs were taken out of Black communities, and Blacks were largely concentrated in manufacturing jobs. That really fragmented the Black family. We had 75% of Black families from 1865 to 1968 were two-parent households. Now in the United States, 29%. And 50% for whites, where it used to be 75%. And the main reason is people are in low-paying jobs and can't afford families. Your family systems, I'm sure, are larger than 29% because you have a social safety net in the UK, which is being eroded by neoliberalism or by the attempt to privatize everything, which is coming from the United States. But you still have support systems that we don't have in the US. So those support systems, when they're lacking, when a community gets hit, it's harder. So when they put drugs in the Black community in the 1980s, and the Central Intelligence Agency admits they put them in there, and now Black communities are being broken up through redevelopment and other things. These are agencies that deliberately sought to break up Black communities so there'd be no power for resistance. Then what you have is the businesses that we had in our community. Many of those are being destroyed. And with the drugs comes gangs, and with gangs comes violence. And so what happens is there's a rupture between the old and the young. A fear develops there. And then with the corporatization, which you have in the UK, of everything is about money, everything's about material things. The youth begins to be exposed to that. And if institutions are weakened, then the media has a greater influence on them than it's ever had before. So then the institution of elderhood comes into question. And this is the real problem now. But we still have the institution of elderhood. And we see this on the internet now with young people looking to wise elders for support.
Yeah. So like even as we were talking through these elders now, informs of what I always like to talk about is the migration, because I'm a person is that I have my belief in understanding that if I'm a divine being living a human experience, I will claim the globe in its format. But people are still looking for identification. But if we look into time, migration has been a high topic of mixture of people right from the beginning. So in forms of claiming certain places, it's very difficult to claim. I just want you to give us a little understanding of migration, of how it happened in the past and how it's working till today.
Well, in your case, in the United Kingdom, migration has a lot to do with Caribbean people, especially migrating from the Caribbean into places like the United Kingdom, and for France in places like France from the Caribbean. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of work in your own islands. And at the end of World War II, and your islands, as you know, the British, instead of going high tech and rebuilding the manufacturing industry, brought in Africans from the Caribbean to do service work, and continued in their old economy. Whereas in Germany, they were literally bombed out, and they started from scratch and built a fairly high-tech society. So migration has been a reality for Caribbean people. They've had to go different places to search for work. And then when they get into these societies, they intend often to go back after they've made a certain amount of money. Some do, most don't, because they end up forming attachments to these new countries. And then with the second generation, those who are born in the UK, then you have the phenomenon of Black British and the mentalities that develop out of that reality. And then third generations. So that's the complexity of your situation. In the United States, migration has played more the role for Black people of migrating from the South to the North, migrating from the place where there was heavy racism, the Ku Klux Klan and everything else, to the North, where they thought they would have better opportunities, but where they also found racism. But during wars, they found the opportunity for jobs in manufacturing and stuff like that. So that enabled Blacks to at least do a little bit more in the way of prosperity, and even though economically, even though they faced vicious racism. So the Garvey movement is a product of rural Southern Blacks who were the base of Garvey's movement. They provided the majority of the support, but the place where he could organize his headquarters was in New York, and his second best chapter was in Philadelphia, because there you had more freedom of movement. And so he could push out his propaganda through the Universal Negro Improvement Association's Negro World. So migration, Garvey migrates from the Caribbean to the US, comes into a situation where he's in the midst of World War I. Garvey is supportive of the King of England. Garvey supports World War I. And it's at the end of World War I that Black people in the US, who had also fought in that war, just as many Blacks in the Caribbean and Africa had, they get angry. They see they were used. And so you have the emergence of an awakened African in the United States, and that awakened African wakes Garvey up. This is a story most people don't know. And then when Garvey is awakened, Garvey then goes back and wakens up Black people. So it's a dual thing going on there. So migration has its effect of impacting Garvey migrating from Jamaica, where he can't get his movement off the ground, to a fertile source that you wouldn't think would be, because we're under lockdown here. We're under Ku Klux Klan violence. But Black people are standing up to that. And then the racism in the North. Yet it's the fertile ground for Garvey to launch his movement, but only the African American who undergoes what's called race consciousness, something that Africans in the Caribbean didn't have to experience, because race consciousness comes from 24/7, 24-hour-a-day racism. And so out of that, Black people in this country suspect this conspiracy when it's not happening. But most of the time it is, you know what I mean? And so Garvey becomes exposed to this race consciousness, and without race consciousness, there would have been no Garvey movement. And without Garvey, there would have been no Garvey movement, because he brings in the Caribbean strain, which is this idea, even though Garvey had not yet, Jamaica had not yet become independent, that you could rule yourself. So Garvey comes in with an idea of an organization that's like a nation in exile. He's got his own little army, even though, you know, they're not carrying guns in public. He's got his Black Nurses Corps. He's the provisional president of Africa. He's got that conception, which some of us had too, but he brings in this idea of self-government. And so it's this marriage. So migration is complex. Now in this country, let's deal with another dimension of migration. By 2040, 2044, America will be a majority black, brown, red, and yellow country. And in fact, Trump is out of office because of black and brown and red people and yellow people voted, blacks in the largest number, 89% of blacks voting against Trump. So by 2044 or sooner, the majority of this country will not be white anymore. And so that's the result of migration. That's the result of the migration of Mexicans into this country, Asians, and it's brought about by the Black Freedom Movement. The Black Freedom Movement did not call for the ending of the immigration laws in this country that kept people of color out. But it was the spirit of the Black Freedom Movement that led Johnson, who was president then, Lyndon Johnson and others, to push for that. Never did they suspect that there would be a flood of Mexicans, Latinos, and Asians coming into the country. And never did they expect that their birth rate would decline. And so now migration has the effect of changing the political complexion of this country and eventually the power of this country. You know that Brexit in the UK has got a lot to do with migration. In this case, of Europeans from other countries coming into Britain, and also their attitudes towards the European Union. And so the racism that a Boris Johnson raised up accounts for the foolish decision of the British to withdraw from the European Union. I would say foolish only because that's their largest trading partner. It's not the United States, it's the European Union. And you cut yourself off from that, that's insane. You know, I'm not feeling bad for it. I'm just simply saying it's not a rational decision. And a lot of that is based on inter-ethnic racism that the Europeans have towards each other. You can call it inter-ethnic nationalism. And so as a result of that, that migration is causing some real problems for Britain. And by the way, Boris Johnson and Trump made of the same cloth, because immigration has been the major reason that Trump got the electoral victory he had in 2016. White people saw now that Latinos and Asians and blacks were going to sweep over them. And Trump became like the messenger that said, no, that's not going to happen. And Boris Johnson was a messenger for Brexit. And this is foolishness in the end. So migration has a lot of different complexities to it. You know what I mean?
And so like in the forms of your understanding, how do you see in forms of migration in Africa itself, and especially in the old civilizations, because it was something of awareness and an understanding that they try to stop the migration, but what kind of understanding do you have within the African the motherland itself?
Well, John Henry Clark, who was someone that I studied under, a master scholar, beautiful human being, he made the point, and then Basil Davidson, who is a European historian coming from Britain, has written a book called The Curse of the Nation State in Africa. And African scholars have written on this same thing. One of the biggest problems that Africa inherited with independence was that we bought into, that is, the independence leaders bought into the European nation state model without questioning it. I spent 3 months in Tanzania in 1973 with members of the Pan-African People's Organization. We worked in the Ujamaa villages. These are the villages in Africa. Ujamaa means familyhood. And Julius Nyerere was then building up the villages in Tanzania to really take care of the people, providing healthcare, education, and being able to feed itself. And it was frustrated by brainwashed Africans inside who were around Nyerere who frustrated this, and of course by international forces. But Nyerere was best at this. And Nyerere was one of the best of Africa's leaders, but he made the point that he had never questioned the European nation state model. And so part of this thing of migration is with the European nation state models, now you get fixed borders, you know, and this idea that one nation is bounded by a certain set of borders and another by another set. And these are borders established by European colonialism. And so you can have the Ghanaian nation, the nation of Ghana, with strict borders, but the people next to them are made up of the same ethnic group that's in Ghana. And you have that across Africa. So it works against migration. And then it can also, because of the European nation state, which is based on John Locke, which is the political philosopher who wrote the two treaties of government. And it's the second treaties of government that the United States is based on, and your parliament is based on, though the American system is based on it more than yours, because under the American system, there is no royalty under this system, though there's a royalty of economic power. They really rule royally. So the John Locke model is a model where government is established to protect private property. That's the role of government. And so armies are built up for the purpose of protecting the people who run the government, not from foreign powers largely, but from their own people. Because the European nation state is set up so the very few own most of what's is the wealth inside those countries. So all of that prohibits migration or movement. You've seen in South Africa real problems recently of migrants who, when hard time comes in South Africa, there's a movement to kick them out of South Africa, you know? And this is based on this European nation state model, because Africans have always interchanged and interacted with each other, and they did not have a boundaries, you know, the kind of boundaries that the European had. So Africans need to be moving and drawing from each other, but more important, Africa needs unity, and Africa needs to be able to build from what it has to be able to build continental unity, which is a struggle that has been something that Africans have sought and have struggled over for a long time. Kwame Nkrumah being one of the visionaries of that. So that is the bigger question for Africa, is African unity.
Okay, so it, like in the States right now, growing up in the States, and we're talking about the migration, in trying to galvanize people together, would you say it's a very strong struggle within the States itself, in the fact that there's so many different groups and the groups are increasing, like as if there's different forms of tribes, and because they're following their ideologies, they're not able to they're finding it very difficult to bond within the States itself? Do you envision that?
Well, you know, building unity is always difficult. So, and there would never be a period for any people where everybody is unified. No people. And the European is the best example of that. That's why we got
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. There's just a bit of a delay.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a bit of a delay.
Okay. Yeah, so in the United
Yeah, I
States,
can hear you. There's a bit of a delay.
okay, in the United States, there's we're 40, 50 million people in numbers. So of course, unity is not easy. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at what's been happening in this country, we have had various movements, and these movements have been quite successful. Uh, the Southern movement in the 60s that broke the back of Southern apartheid, that was a successful movement. And that occurred before the end of apartheid in South Africa, and against greater odds in the sense that the power that whites wielded not only in the South and the North against this movement. And there was unified support for that movement. And if you look at, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott, which was the mass kickoff of that movement, you'll see that 97% of Black people in Montgomery, Alabama supported that boycott. 97%. In the history of the United States, 97% of white people have never stood behind anything. The War of Independence, 1/3 opposed it, 1/3 was neutral, 1/3 supported it. This last election, 37% of whites voted for Biden. The other group voted for Trump. But the point is, it wasn't all white people or even 90%, but 89% of Black people moved the same way. So when Black people move, we do move as a unit. Now, here's a key point. In the States, I hope you don't miss this. You had a serious uprising over the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor murders. I know you noticed that. 50 states, 50 countries, millions of people went into motion. In fact, Trump would probably still be in office but for that movement, because that movement brought out thousands of youth of all races, white, brown, red, yellow, black. So the key thing is, this Black Lives Matter movement is like the peak of something very strong that came out of Ferguson in 2014 with the Michael Brown murder. And so over a period of time, what you've seen is the emergence of a very sophisticated movement among our people that has centered on the key issue facing Black youth today, especially Black males, but Black youth period, and Black people in general, the police. Whereas the central issue in the 60s in the South was segregation. In the North, and it continues to be, is jobs. The key firing point that fire people up and anger them are the police. And so a movement has been built around anti-police violence. And that movement has been broad and deep. And so what you saw, and for months, that movement went on, months. And number of shootings, Trump bringing out the right wing, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, and everything else, ultimately used to try to intimidate Black people not to vote. So what you're seeing is this grouping that's called Black Lives Matter, which is more than Black Lives Matter. It's a network of a bunch of different groupings. They've learned lessons from our past. One of the biggest lessons they've learned is this: weak movements have strong leaders. Strong movements don't need strong leaders. And in fact, the age of the single leader is gone. It's dead. And I've been arguing this for 25 years. My books, The Art of Leadership, call for collective leadership. Because what worked in one period won't work now. It will not work now. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, they've drawn from Sister Ella Baker. And she had this idea of group-centered leadership. This goes back to the Twa, because among the Twa, there were no leaders. Everybody had a say-so in leadership. And so they now call their system of leadership full of leaders. So many leaders that the FBI and CIA can't figure out where they all are. And because of the nature of our culture, because liberation movements are expressions of culture, African American culture is the culture of popular choice of the United States. It's the culture of popular choice of the world. And it is the most complex culture in the United States, may well be in the world. And our movements are expressions of that. So jazz, for example, which is the expression of the art form. Out of enslavement, we created not only a culture, which I call New African, which is based on fundamental African principles and new ones. And one of the new ones is race consciousness. The other new one is Pan-Africanism, the idea of one Africa. We didn't invent that on our own. People from Trinidad, from the Caribbean, also came up with that idea, the idea of one Africa, based on the love of African people. So this Black Lives Matter movement, as was true of the Black Power movement, as was true of the Black Panther movement, as was true of the Black Freedom movement, as was true of the Afrocentric movement. These are reflections of our culture, the best parts of our culture. And so the fact that you have this idea of group-centered leadership or leaderful in jazz, what you have is what they call an aristocracy of democracy. In other words, the musicians are often counts and dukes and ladies. They're aristocratic. But when it comes to playing, it's democratic. It's called improvising, or it's called innovation. And one of the things about Black people all over the world is we're smarter than the people who oppress us. We often just don't always realize it. Some of us do, some of us don't. But in the case of Black Lives Matter, it's a good example of a movement that has outsmarted the system. They've done a very good job of that. And by the way, people who are listening to this, when you go to my show, the Dr. Oba T'Shaka show, I would suggest that you look at a DVD of a presentation I did called Lessons from Post-Reconstruction for Voting Trump Out of the White House into the Jailhouse, because what it shows is what we have is in the US, Blacks are strategically located, as you are in Europe. And when we create a change here, it has an effect around the world. So what I'd say is that what we have now is a lot of power that we can, thanks for putting that up. We have a lot of power that we are exercising. And when we move, we tend to make the world move. And that's true of a lot of African people, but it's especially true here in the US. So I would say that, yeah, we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of confusion going on. We still got Blacks killing Blacks. At the very time you have Black Lives Matter, you got these Negroes out here killing each other. You understand? That kind of stuff has got to stop. That has been put in there by the drugs and by the values that have come with these forces that have hit our communities. So we have a lot of work to do, but we also have made some very important moves. And we should not underestimate them, because we often tend not to appreciate our gains. We tend often not to appreciate our victories. And I'm very proud. I'm 81 years old. I'm very proud of these young people who are doing this work. And a lot of them are sisters. A lot of them are sisters. And the reason is because the families have been weakened. Sisters have come forward as a very strong force. And they have come forward fighting for brothers who've been murdered by the police, showing the love that they have for their brothers and the love that we have for them. So I'm very proud of them. They have taken chapters out of our books of organizing, and they've taken them to another level. We're proud of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I just wanted to say, what is the future holding for Oba T'Shaka? What have you got for us for the future?
Well, first of all, as a strategist, I plan to live a long, long life. And so far, 81, no illnesses, because I pursued a policy of health. By the way, your health is your wealth. We always say that, but then we're always pursuing everything but what's most important. And your health comes before everything else. You've got to look after your health. So what's in store for me is I'm going to be continuing to do a lot of writing. This book on Seba is a major work because I'm a revolutionary. So let's get something straight here. I'm about transformation and changing the systems under which we live. So I've created a number of systems, one of which is to free the mind. It's called the Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom. I created this with a brother named Bulanlela Wabogo, a brilliant chemist, musician, martial artist, historian. It's the only innovation with someone else. This one describes the stages we go through when we're waking up. The Dr. Oba T'Shaka show is based on that. And if you go to YouTube, there are a number of things where look for the Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom, where you can get exposed to this. It tells you where you are in an awakening process. And if you're not awake, where you are in the sleeping process. If you're a Rip Van Winkle and you're asleep, it will definitely identify what's the cause of that and what might get you to wake up. So that's a system that I put forward. Twin lineal families, that system that comes out of African family systems. This is one that I'm pushing and encouraging African people to look at because it's one of empowering both males and females and showing respect for the masculine and feminine principles in our culture. And it encourages creativity. And this book that I'm finishing now, this is a replacement system for Western systems of miseducation. Carter G. Woodson, in his book, Miseducation of the Negro, he identified the primary problem is the information that we receive, that we're miseducated because we've been taught their history, their philosophy, their culture, their religion, their politics, their economics. And while I agree with that, I point out that we are also taught through their method of teaching. And that's called, in the West, they call it pedagogy. In Africa, it was called Seba, which is bringing out the gifts that are within. And so we have a problem today. We have African-centered thought for those of us that have it, and most of us don't, and we need to get that to more of our people. But we have a European method for teaching it. And that European method is basically informational based. And the African method is transformational based. And so this Seba work that I'm working on now takes 6 masters. John Coltrane in music, John Henry Clark in scholarship, Ella Baker as a leader, Theophilo Benga as a great scholar, Amilcar Cabral as a scholar, as an artist, as a leader, as a military strategist. And I have to put myself in there because if you haven't gone through this, you can't explain how this works. And so I'm showing how these masters started from just average to becoming masters of their realm. What is it that made them the masters that they are? And that is what our mastery system produces. That's the one that I described with the Bombara after 21, so that's a replacement system for the Western system, because what happens when we free ourselves from, let's say Africa can unify itself? Is it going to be on the model of the European Union? Is it? It's not worth it then, because the European Union is exploiting European people. And that's part of the reason why Brexit occurred, because Europeans, and in this case, the British, the whites, some of them see they haven't benefited from what has benefited the corporations that run the European Union. So we have to have systems that reproduce our societies, that reproduce our humanity, that reproduce a system of sharing. And so that's what this book on Seba explains. I've gone through this process. If you find any master in any realm, they've gone through this system. They may not know what it is. I interviewed John Henry Clark the last 8 months of his life on the masters who had shaped him. He didn't know the system that had shaped him was an African system. He knew that the people that he went up under, Arthur Schoenberg and others, were masters, and he was drawing from the best. But he didn't know the roots of this system in Africa. And so that's a part of what we have to do now. While we're moving to change our realities, we have to prepare for the societies that we want to put in place of the one that's impressing us now. And those systems will be good for everybody because these are not systems that oppress people. So what's in store for me? Also, I'm into leadership training. So I know that I have my experience I want to exchange with the young, but I want to learn from the young. So there'd be an interactive, and I've started that process of training young people and learning from them because they have skills we don't have, and we learn from them. So it's an interactive learning process. So that's part of it. And then I'm married, so I'm enjoying my life. You got to have love in your life. You know what I mean? Got to have a good woman in your life. You know what I mean? What's the point of a revolution without love and without some beauty? So I think that's also important. So I don't know what's in store for me, but I know that I've still got a lot to offer. And I really enjoy you giving me the opportunity to share things with your audience.
So Baba T, what I say is, I know there's a bit of a delay, but I just want you to introduce how can they find your books?
Right. You can either go to, well, the best thing for the UK is to go to Pedagogy Distributors. Brother Pedagogy. Are you familiar with Brother Pedagogy?
Yeah, Brother Pedagogy in Tottenham High Road. So yeah, he stocks a lot of books. I think it's 3, 4. I think it's 3, 4, 5. Just right beside the Tottenham police station. But you just put Pedagogy stores, and it should come up. Or I'll get some details, and I will put it in the description box so that people can able to purchase your books. But if they are not in within the UK, let's say, for instance, they're in the States or anywhere else, how can they purchase it?
They can also purchase the books through, I'm just trying to remember, through Gumroad. You go to Gumroad, Oba T'Shaka, Gumroad, Gumroad, and you can purchase the books that way. For people in the UK, it would be better to go to Pedagogy because the shipping costs are expensive if you send a book from the United States to the UK. So it's easier to get them directly from him. And I've sent him some books recently. He's done distribution for us. But in other areas, Gumroad. Go to Gumroad, Oba T'Shaka, and you can purchase the books that way. And also have some DVDs and other things.
Okay. As I would say, it was good having you on at this moment as we reach the hour and a half mark. We would love to have you back again, and because we do quite a few other events, it would be nice for you to come on one of our events and speak again.
I'd love to. Anytime, brother. I'm available, Have knowledge, will travel.
There is a bit of a delay.
Yeah, I hear you. Yes, I'd love to do that.
Okay, so we will reach out to you and get back.
Good.
Yep, 100%.
Okay. Thank you, brother.
Okay,
Really
so people, people, thank you for coming in. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the information, and we would speak once again, and we're going to able to see you tomorrow as we have a music event. So please enjoy